faculty members come together into a hub. Its main goal is to serve as the space where students can, through the development of knowledge and skills, be more marketable and in that way empower them for the job market, which I think that's why we are in grad school, right?
Good job.
I was. Yeah. And I'm very excited. This is my research team, my colleagues. We're going to present this proposal that was recently selected for funding by the TIAA. We're going to talk about what was the process of getting this idea, how we went about doing it. I think that we did it in about 2 weeks, right? From the start to finish, and it is not a humongous amount of money, $70,000, but $70,000 goes a long way. And we're actually going to talk about what we are proposing with this research initiative and how, in addition, above and beyond money, what this represents for the job market. So, do you guys want to introduce yourselves?
Sure.
Adam was just going to go. My name is Odle. I'm a first-year Ph.D. student in higher education.
I'm Adam Edgerton. I'm a third-year Ph.D. candidate in education policy.
Yeon, I'm also a first-year Ph.D. student in higher education.
Good. So, were you able to get the files that we're going to be talking about today? So, let me just begin. I'm going to start us off by looking at, this is the information that we received. This is called request for proposals or request for applications. Other places call it letter of interest. Letter of interest is a little bit different in the sense that you submit a very short version of what you want to study, and the funding institute decides whether or not you should submit a full proposal. So in this case, this is a full proposal that we submitted. But as you can see, the TIAA has several, let me see. Oh, there you go. Has the following big categories: financial security, higher education, and endowments, foundations, and philanthropy. Of course, we are dealing with education policy and higher education policy, and our main interest, scope is related to higher education issues. Having said that, the TIAA is an organization that deals with security and retirement plans for teachers across the United States. It's a humongous organization. So we were very strategic about what we wanted to provide them with. So we have academic workforce, trends and issues, higher education leadership, innovation and financial sustainability. And as you will see, we at least touched on 2 of the 3 main focus areas that they are requesting: academic workforce, trends and issues, and innovation and financial sustainability. But there is not much information aside from this about what they are actually requesting or requiring, or what they want to fund. So we're going to also talk about how was our strategy to sell them the idea that what we were proposing is important for them. Okay, there you go.
Okay, so we're just going to talk generally about grant crafting ideas, and I'm reflecting on my experiences both on this project, being on an existing grant, and then also trying to write solo grants as a doctoral student, which I think is the hardest thing, right? It can be easy to kind of generate ideas in a group, but it's so much harder, I think, to think of things on your own. So I'm going to just generally talk about my experiences with those processes, and then we'll get back to the specifics of this particular grant. So like all research, we have to start with a research question. I think we all learned this in Research 101. But specifically, when you're looking at funders, you have to really look at what's already been funded. So your interests may be very well defined through your potential dissertation, for example, but it may not be a fit for that particular funder. So one thing I always do is read through all of the projects that have been funded beforehand before deciding whether my research question is a good fit for that organization. And that may seem kind of obvious, but you have to do a lot of groundwork to learn about the organization before you decide whether it's worth your time to fill out the application. Finally, thinking about the budget is something that as a graduate student, I had no clue like how much things cost. And I think that is something also that looking at sample budgets, asking for other people for help, and thinking about what is like a reasonable project given the maximum budget amount for this grant. And then finally, I think the most successful proposals think ahead of time about findings that would have broad relevance. Okay, so it's not just something that you're really interested in, but it's something that you could imagine being published in a major journal, or maybe in an op-ed, or maybe in some kind of practitioner-friendly brief. So those kind of projects are going to be much more successful to people reading your grant, often people who are not academics or who don't really care as much about academic journals as they care about disseminating findings broadly. So I came up with 3 things to have in place. First, an appropriate scope for your data collection within the time frame available. Number 2 is a strong theory of action. So, for example, you could pick a topic that a lot of people might be interested in. For example, we're looking at adjunct faculty salaries and retirement plans in our proposal. So there's a lot of things going on with adjunct faculty, but it's not enough to just pick a topic that's relevant and current. It's also thinking about what's a strong theoretical framework that you can put into place that you can explain in simple, clear language. In my experience, those are the proposals also that are successful, but don't kind of go too far. So step 3 is not giving this exhaustive lit review like you might see in a journal article, but thinking about what is it that a reader who has no prior knowledge of your topic needs to know to understand why your grant is important and worth funding.
If I may, there are two aspects that differentiate this work from previous funded work by the TIAA or TIAA. One, we are building upon what they have funded in the past, adjuncts, and they do care about that. But we are having a twist for that. Do you guys remember what that twist was? And actually, the title of the grant, the proposal says it all. So we are calling it employment volatility in terms of the highest insecurity that faculty members can experience, like having an appointment of 1 year or less. No multi-year appointments, non tenure track. It is 1 year or less. And we were saying, you guys have studied this in the past. We are going to focus on this particular, more at risk sort of type of population.
Yeah, and it also narrows the scope. So you want to talk about?
Yeah, and just to also build off Adam's point about concise literature review. So I'm coming at it as like a person who's writing grants for the first time as a first-year student, and that was one of the hardest switches that I had to make from doing from all my classes. I'm so used to thinking of literature review as this like thorough covering of all literature so that it provides a strong basis for the research questions that I'm asking. And just to make that switch of like, what are really the relevant themes in literature that I need to mention? Like, I don't even mention everything because I think I went back to like 1990 something and people were like, no, you don't need to go that far. So that was like a point of reference for me. So I can talk more about our specific project, although I know you guys had copies of it. So the titles up there is sort of the headers that we had for a grant proposal, just so that you have an idea of how to structure it. But it also depends on the research call for proposal. So the motivation, significance, and goals, our goal was to better understand how faculty members holding volatile academic appointments, defined as what Manuel just mentioned, navigate their savings and retirement plans. And one of the things that we had to do was like, how do we couch this in sort of the previous literature, but also the practical implications because we're submitting a grant to this specific firm. that has very practical interest in financial savings and retirement. So how do we hit two birds with one stone, right? So in terms of our academic and research rationale, we were making the same kind of argument that Manuel was making in terms of there's not a lot of research on adjunct faculty to start with. There's more research on these more traditional models of faculty, but then within that literature, we were saying that adjunct faculty, despite a lot of variations in their appointment length and contracts, all get lumped in this one category. So we wanted to really deepen the literature on that. And then we were also making a case that this is really important because these kind of appointments are growing. They're about 2/3 of the total faculty appointments now. In terms of the practical one, we were making the case that these findings that we have would also have relevance in terms of firms like TIA, who can now develop more services and plans that could help these faculty navigate more volatile employment conditions.
And I could just say too, so like Adam and Manuel and Yeon had mentioned too, that in crafting these like research questions, they weren't necessarily things that we draw on like theoretical underpinnings of specifically. Like we knew our audience, TIA, who had done an enormous amount of work in the area of contingent faculty, working with scholars from University of Southern California and other. They're kind of like one of the leading research bodies on adjunct faculty across the country. However, they also have a vested interest and they've done a large body of work on retirement planning for faculty and staff. And so we read all of their research reports in these areas and identified and noted in our proposal gaps that previous researchers that they had funded and previous own institute projects that they had worked on, that they had not answered some specific questions that may be of interest to them too. So it wasn't necessarily something that we like had an overriding interest and TIA then came along and then like things matched well perfectly. We had a general interest, but to meet the specific needs of the grant and to exploit variations and missing pieces of the literature, our proposal and our questions developed from that. And I'll also say too, because we're writing for a major funding audience, I think it was important for us too to kind of understand their capacity. And so TIA has like the TIA Institute where they have PhDs on staff and they do their own research. And so that's important to what Yeon was mentioning before, in that we didn't have to set up what are faculty, what are adjunct faculty, like these are content experts in the area. And so we were able to write to some of these specific areas, but also understand that if we missed an important piece of the literature or an important development in the area, they would know that too. And so we had to do some more due diligence in that area. But that's where these like research interests and gaps came from, and also the knowledge that this is a large organization who services a lot of institutions, most institutions across the country, and the ability to contribute to these faculty, but also to that organization in terms of new product line or opportunities was really important too. And so we tried to weave that throughout the entire proposal so that the reviewers could see that too.
Yeah, and as I'm listening to Taylor, like it's very, very different than writing like a dissertation grant proposal. So we can talk about that if we have time, but I know some of you may be interested in that as well.
So these are the research questions that we asked. I won't read out all of them. We had total 5. But one thing that I would mention about these research questions is I think one major theme that we've been talking about this whole time is like know your audience, right? But I think the second part of it is how can you make it work so that you can also get enough data or ask the really interesting questions that you might want to know about these sections of the faculty. So we spent a lot of time thinking about, okay, what are some key things that we know TIA would be interested in, but what are some things that we want to know? Like how does this kind of employment volatility influence their teaching, or how does it influence institutions? And we wanted to know variations in terms of institutions, variations in terms of faculty demographic groups. So we ended up asking a lot of these broader questions that we wanted to put in there to meet our grant proposal, but also couched in other areas of analysis that we wanted to do with the data that we're getting. And yeah.
So also to piggyback on that, when we found an interest in merging kind of higher ed, these volatile appointments, and individual faculty retirement or savings plans, there's a difficulty in garnering data in that area. And so Manuel had done a lot of the initial work and conceptualizing the idea and finding about but how big are adjunct faculty? Like, what are adjunct faculty? What sectors of higher ed are they concentrated in? And you kind of are going only to like the integrated post-secondary education data system to find general counts and like where these people are, where these faculty are located. And so there exists a gap exists on general data in these areas. And so that became what you'll see is like a major part of our general recommendation is we don't know anything about now the majority of faculty, like where they are, where they're teaching, what their credentials are like, what their employment conditions are. And so we then wrap that up too into like one of our major methods. And so we proposed a mixed method study to kind of couch each of these questions. One in like, who are these faculty? What's going on? What are their general savings and retirement behaviors? What options are available to them? What options are needed? And second order, what is the effect or what is the association between having this contingent position and general well-being, financial security, your thoughts on planning your retirement, and how you then navigate or access some of these institutional resources that are either available to you or are not available to you. And so we're proposing to do isolate 6 institutions that represent diverse locales and sectors across the United States and conduct interviews with faculty at those institutions and to leverage, I think, some previous relationships with faculty unions or teacher like federations to get those individuals. And then we hope to conduct with Manuel's expertise and our learning, quantitative analyses of those qualitative data that we garner from the semi-structured interviews, and then use some of those findings to inform what we hope to pilot as the first national survey of these adjunct faculty holding these appointments. So then we can hopefully draw some more, at least representative guesses of what types of options are available to these faculty, where are they, and what their general life looks like, and then do some subsequent very basic quantitative analyses on those survey findings. And hopefully this can become a longitudinal project that TIA or Penn may have an interest in continuing.
Yeah,
that's a product that
Sorry, go ahead.
that is another product that we are proposing to give to TIA, that they can use this survey as their place, and we will be more than happy to continue receiving money to help them to do this as well. So it is a win-win situation.
Yeah, I just want to highlight 2 things that Taylor talked about. The specificity of the methodology, I think, is so important. I read a lot of proposals that don't say how many interviews they're going to do. So like really getting down to that level of detail, I think, is more persuasive to funders. And the second thing is that you'll notice that this is a mixed methods descriptive study, and I think that it's especially if you take a lot of causal inference classes, like you don't need a causal inference question to have a really good grant.
Yeah. And part of the crafting of these ideas is the scope, because we want to provide something that is useful for the funder, but we also are interested on the academic side of it and want to not oversell our idea, not to offer something that cannot be completed in 1 year. So we have, if we happen to get this grant and we cannot deliver the final product, the likelihood of us getting another one is 0. So as researchers, junior researchers, and researchers in training and whatnot, we don't want to have a bad reputation in that way.
Yeah, I think to follow up on what Adam was saying too, like I think we all we debated like through all these drafts on like the level of specificity for some of our like the methodology section. I mean, like we talked about like eigenvectors and like social network analysis too, that we're going to collect this data, it will be analyzed in this way so that the people who are content experts could also like have good information about what we were doing. And I think it was difficult, or at least for me, and maybe like Yeon too, to like we were concerned with the idea, and it was like there's this gap, and like that was like the selling point. But I think hopefully something that strengthened the proposal was we had an idea, but we also had a very clear and attainable way of addressing the idea, and ultimately like following through by like completing the project.
And this can definitely be done. So that's important.
So this was the final section. So practical implications. So we talked about how new directions for future research, we could highlight some of that and then identify ways organizations like TIA could develop new products and services to better services faculty. But another section that we had to write was we had to share about these outlets that we plan to share our research through. So one of them was identifying potential sources of publication, and then another was identifying conferences. So I think in the file that you got, there's actually a list, but here are some of the publications and conferences that we said we're considering as outlets for research. So yeah, that's pretty much our proposal in a nutshell. I think do you have anything, you guys have anything to add?
Could you please go to the PDF for a second?
You know how to do that. Yes.
Oh, you're a Mac user.
Yeah.
So these are the, let's see, how to apply. One thing that it has worked very well for, thankfully for me and for us now, is that it is a good idea to copy and paste these things and fill them out.
Mhm.
You don't want to miss anything that they are requesting. And the best approach to do it is just literally copy, paste, and start completing. It should be your basic fundamental structure to make sure that you are not missing anything.
And also, I think this was one of those things where like the proofreading really helped because it had to be concise, but it also had to be in a language that makes sense to other people. Otherwise, you're not going to get the grant. So we did a lot of versions of like, oh, this doesn't really make sense for me, and then we edit it. So even if you're applying alone, I think it's really helpful to have other people read it over just so that it makes sense.
Yeah, and I think we learned so we literally did copy and paste this, into a Google Doc. And I think it may be like project specific, or if you're doing this individually or with a project team. I think for this proposal, we kind of all took ownership over the entire document. And so we all talked about the lit review. We all talked about the methodology. We all made contributions to like available outlets. And I should also preface that I'm not an expert in securing grants. Manuel does a very good job at doing that. And I was so far I'm 1 for 1, so I'm learning too. But I think that hopefully more. I think that in some other grants that we've submitted since this time, I think that whatever if someone has a particular content expertise in an area, then probably let that person handle the lit review, or let that person handle the implications for practice or something like that. And I think that's what we've done in other areas. If someone's particularly interested in planning, we're looking at some conferences or stuff like that, let them cover those areas. And so it doesn't have to be everyone's hands, on every piece of the product. But it does help to have a team member or a team leader ensuring kind of cohesion between those areas, because you can all have very different pros and tenets and ways that you address the proposal. So hopefully it was cohesive enough.
And it should read as if one person wrote it, not multiple individuals. It has to flow, and you have to be consistent and concise and precise and clear. So yeah, the whole idea is to give a brief description of this and open the floor for you guys to ask questions, or we can spend more time talking about the proposal.
Sorry, hi. I have a question about.
Can you introduce yourself?
Oh, sure. Hi, everyone. I'm Jillian. I work at Penn, and I did my master's in higher ed here. I have a question about how you come up with a budget for something like this. Do you kind of just ask other people who've done it before and ask what they do? What even goes into that budget? What do you even ask for? So if you could talk about your experience with this project.
Well, there are some things that are easier than others. For example, as part of being at Penn, the students can get up to $5,000 in funding for the summer. And that typically can come from the Graduate School of Education, or can come directly from grant funding. And $15,000 of the $70,000 were just dedicated by providing this support for summer. So there are other things that are a little bit more complicated. For example, we are proposing to have trips. So we are saying the 4 of us, if possible, are going to go on a trip. So we have to have nights and the hotels, the travel and whatnot. But yes, that's another important aspect that to the extent possible, getting previous grants that have been successful and even those who have not been successful and analyze them is a good strategy to learn from.
And Penn has a template as well.
But yeah, and I think some like also like there are some like fixed costs, if you will, not in the technical term. Like so we are like also proposing to provide some like incentives for survey completion and participation for some participants, and so that's fixed by the grant available size, but also by your preferred like sample size, right? And so we had conversations about like what's an appropriate level of compensation, you know, for participants, or what's an appropriate incentive structure for survey completions. I think that was an important part. And then I think also like depending on your department or what institution you're at, like there can be wide arrays of administrative like costs and overhead that your institution may have on top of the grant as well.
And direct costs.
Also, conference travel is a good item for presentation of the findings and whatnot. And I think that a very important aspect that typically I had to learn it myself, by myself. That's why I'm so excited to have these opportunities to share before you guys have to do it yourselves alone. These grants are most of the time do not represent monetary compensation. The currency is academic, and it is academics to show potential funders in the future that you have experience getting these grants, so that it's going to make you more likely for them to evaluate your CV and say, well, this person has gotten these grants, has completed this grant, these publications have come from those grants, more than getting summer funds or money or whatnot. So it's an important aspect when creating the budget, that the main goal is to build your academic CV and currency.
I have two questions that aren't totally related, but quickly. So the first one, so you talked about how you were like strategically working together to leverage your strengths in making this. When you're done, or you think you're done, do you go to someone outside of your group to have them read through it? And if so, like, what's the rationale? What are you asking them? That's the first one. And then the second one, you can attack either. Is there like a list of grants that you would recommend, or anyone here would recommend, that are good sort of like first attempt grants? Does that make sense? So like while we're looking either in like our own teams or like on our own, grants that you feel like obviously aren't easy to get but might be like more accessible than some of the big ones.
Yeah, well, the first question, I'll answer the second question because it came anyway.
Most recently.
Most recently. So, in preparing for like my dissertation proposal and writing a larger Spencer grant, I wrote a Russell Sage grant the winter before. And that was like a call that came just for graduate students. I think I got the email through AERA using a Stanford Education Data Archive. So I look for those calls because usually it's like, you know, a 3 to 5 page thing. And even if you don't get it, and I didn't get it, like it leads to you having to actually put on paper your own ideas and how you would measure them and do them. And it gives you like a deadline. So I thought it was like a great experience. Before doing that all on my own, I just like didn't even know what was what. And so I really recommend, you know, finding those small grants for graduate students and trying one of them, because then it just keeps getting easier and easier.
Yeah, I think there are like, so this I would categorize as a very like targeted grant application. Like there was a pretty clear scope. It was like fall into one of these 3 buckets. Ideally, we'll intersect some of those buckets. And so I think that often lends itself to like a particular set of researchers like applying for those grants. And I think when we've been looking at subsequent grants that are like more broad and like, hey, like send your ideas and like we'll do something. Those seem to be like quite more detailed and like more robust in the like time it takes to develop the proposal and in like the general ways in which you convey like the ideas and the budget and like that. So just like be aware of that, because I think like I was unaware of that. I was thinking they were all going to be very similar, but they're all quite different in their expectations for presentation and what I expect their like competition to be like.
Yeah, for example, I think one of the grants that we thought that we had enough time to work on actually asked a lot of nitty-gritty details about like how we plan to. It was about a conference and inspiring like other people to get together to talk about this topic, and they require a lot of detail and actual logistical planning.
That was by ARA.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then we're like, oh, okay, let's actually plan this and take the time and like talk to these people and get buy-in. But in regards to the first question, I think for this we had enough hands on deck, and also I don't know if this helps, but this is a non-expertise area for me. So when I read it, it doesn't really make sense. I can read it because I don't know about this and I don't know what this means. But I think in general it would be helpful to not just like get someone who doesn't understand the topic to read it, but if you know someone who got the grant before, I can see it really being helpful if they could read it over and say, yeah, no, this doesn't really meld with this kind of grant, or provide feedback on that.
Yeah, usually I ask my friends in like RWL or ECS to read like a policy grant, because like if it doesn't make sense to them, I'm in big trouble. So I think it's very important to have someone like outside of someone who's a totally different methodology from what you usually do to read your work.
I guess like when I would be thinking about if I happened to be doing something like alone, like and having someone else read the grant application, like I think I would rather than look for someone like in a disciplinary perspective, I would just look for someone who's been very successful like garnering like competitive grants. Because I think like after a while it can become like that melding of like art and science. Like you understand what funding boards, funding organizations are looking for, and as long as they have a copy of the RFP, I think they'll be able to provide you really good feedback. Whether or not they're an expert, they know that you need to have a solid lit review, and you did a lit review, and that's great. But you need to develop like implications or something like that too. So I think that's what I would look for, unless you happen to have someone who has received the grant in the past or something.
And I would say that if possible, multiple eyes are better than one. And so if you have to, part of the grant crafting skills is that has to be detailed enough, but also general enough so that anybody can follow the ideas, which is like the balance that is most of the time the most complicated aspect, because you want to provide the judges with enough information about how feasible this is going to be and how rigorous this is going to be, but also you have to inform everybody, non-experts and experts, about what you are proposing and how and why this is important for them. So, if possible, both audiences would be ideal. In our case, I don't think that anybody read this, right? Yeah.
We did it fast.
Yeah.
I think something too. I was looking at another grant to apply for, and it was like very specifically detailed that like you needed to be like a faculty member affiliated with like an American higher ed institution. And so that's okay, because you can have that person like be your PI, and you could be like a co-PI or another person on the process. So I guess just be very well aware of that in advance so that they're able to like sign off on your idea. But also think about like some grant competitions that we've looked at, and like this one like are not blind review processes. And so like you type your name and your affiliation and include your CVs, and sometimes like I think we had to do that for this one. And so include your CV like in the proposal, and so be like prepared to do that. There's like some hidden requirements too. And so at that time, it may be beneficial to leverage, some relationships that you have with people at this institution, or that may have been prolific authors, in that specific area. Or other times if it's going to be blind, then that's not necessarily the case. And you could, take, some like, I guess like your own individual like risks and like trying some new things in those grant competitions.
Yeah, usually the process with my advisor has been like 10 drafts, again, like back and forth. So I think the more time, the better.
So I'm Chris at RWL. Where did you find this one? And then I heard you mention, Adam, you mentioned one about it. You found it in an email. what like is that like this? It's a spontaneous search. Is there like a method to finding the calls?
This goes back a little bit to Abby's question in terms of what are the funders, right? Typically, AERA has every year this call for applications for is one for early career faculty members and one for dissertation fellowships. Spencer has also similar, and the requirements for those two calls for applications are rather quite similar. One exercise that I remember when I was applying for the first time, they say, as a result of my research, the field will know this. Like that question, and you have like a couple of sentences to respond that thing requires a lot of time. In going back to you, so we have ARA, AIR is another one, the Association for Institutional Researchers. They're focusing more on graduate education and law education nowadays. So it's a matter of identifying what the funders are, and typically in the website we are going to have two calls for
Yeah.
proposals.
With ARA, just being a member, you start getting those emails that have all of the graduate student grants. So definitely do that. I think that's pretty much where I.
Yeah, I hear about a bunch from like listservs, like if you're a member of ASH or like other professional
Yeah.
associations, but also like, you know, the like William T. Grant Foundation, like Russell Sage Foundation, like some people in your department where they found funding, like I get a lot of emails and I've signed up for a lot of listservs just to keep an eye out for publication and report opportunities or specifically grant opportunities.
Yeah, I think William T. Grant, Russell Sage, ones where I've applied before.
It would be good to create a bank of.
I think there is one on a Penn website somewhere.
Yeah.
Also, like the provost office at Penn, I know has like they have graduate like fellowships and graduate research grants, stuff like that. I didn't know that. But those are in those like weekly emails or whatever that we get to. So.
Adam, you were talking about applying to dissertation grants. I'm about to get on that train pretty soon here. So kind of what is the guidance somewhat similar, or what is it like when you're doing this on your own versus when you're on a research team?
Well, the dissertation grant is very different. Instead of having a narrow little project, I mean, your project should still be narrow and focused,
Right.
but you're also kind of selling yourself as like a budding scholar. And so you have to do like a personal statement. You have to do more of the like self-promotional stuff, which makes you uncomfortable, but it's like part of the game. And you know, with those, there are basically you know, AERA, Ford Fellowship, Spencer. Many of those you need to be a racial or ethnic minority. Being gay doesn't count. I checked. Yeah, I think for those, it is helpful to think about doing a smaller grant before. I mean, I can't recommend that enough.
Right.
Because all of a sudden I had to like write in a way that anyone could understand, and that that was something I could actually do and measure instead of these like ideas floating in my head.
So which ones do you think that you have to be a minority?
Ford,
Or for
I think ARA has one. Yeah,
one specific for that?
yeah. I think that's it.
What's the question?
Yeah. Hi, I'm Kiva Ali. I'm a master's student in education policy. So I am actually I'm an RA for the Center for Public Health Initiatives, and I actually have, it's a coincidence because I have an assignment that I have to do tonight to research a grant called Evidence for Action, and write up a report on it. So I was sort of wondering, they did ask me to look up previous proposals that were approved, and then like current proposals, and then why they already have this study, but they want to put it on a larger scale. so why it may align. So I'm just sort of wondering what you look for. If you could talk more about like how you find like alignment in like the proposals that were approved, and then how you might like think about whether your proposal would align with that.
When identifying previous funded studies
Yeah.
by TIA,
Yeah.
you guys find?
I don't know if we got a copy of like a previously funded proposal, but but we were able to.
Previous studies, sorry.
Yeah.
So
Oh,
if you-
yeah. So like on their website, they're very neat, like at the TIA Institute, and like we could isolate like which studies fell into like which buckets, and so we could see like the general idea of what contributions that they were looking to make, and to make sure that our scope was on the same level of a theoretical contribution, but also like a practical application for these individuals. For other grants, there was like not a lot of information at all, and so we ended up like reaching out to some people. Like they would provide like an abstract in their name, so we would reach out to those authors and ask if they would be willing to share their funded proposals. Manuel has like always been like pretty like free with sharing information too, and so like that was helpful. But that's basically what we had to do too. So it was a lot of digging, but it was helpful.
And in terms of the scope we leveraged on this, is called the Integrated Post-Secondary Education Data System. I think that since 2014, they started disaggregating these employment lengths by those holding 1 year or less and 1 year appointments. Before they lumped it all together with adjuncts appointments, which contain multi-year plus these previous two, which translated into the organization funding these projects that lumped all of these appointments into a single category, because at the time there was the best that we could have done. So because we found out that we could actually disaggregate them, then we leverage and we say, well, we can actually go deeper and probably serve this huge proportion of the population in this way. So that was part of the scope and how we identify this gap.
Yeah, and I think that reminds me, there's a lot of grants specifically for working with large data sets. So it's something you may have a research question, and you may be thinking about data collection, but there could be a grant that will pay you to use existing data. So I think that's really important to highlight.
Now this is a different question, but 2/3 of all appointments are like 1 year or less.
1 year or less or 1 year, and it varies by sector, with the community college sector reaching 74-72% of those. We're talking faculty appointments, individuals who teach at least one class.
And is that like on the rise or something? Is that like that?
We haven't.
That just seems like a whole thing. Like 2/3 of
there's a lot
all
of
academic jobs are like a year or less adjunct
Yes.
appointments.
Yes.
I'm just, I don't know, just thinking about my career choice.
I
I
mean,
I have to say,
We're
all on the same.
I can speak for recent graduates. A recent graduate from our program, she has like a full-time foundation job and then is an adjunct faculty member as well.
Okay.
So I think that is actually make more money doing that than being a tenured track. So don't be too discouraged. Yeah.
One of the comments I had, I recently applied to one of the dissertation fellowships, the AERA one, and I think one of the advice that I received from someone who had reviewed those for a prior year was how important an optional part of the grant application is. So an appendix is optional, but you can't really, well, I'm a qualitative researcher, so it's hard to explain how you generate your codes and your conceptual framework within the limited space for the 8-page application. So they were telling me it's important to have a good appendix that shows how I'm generating my thematic codes.
Yeah.
And had I not gotten that advice, I would have had, to me, a competitive application, but I wouldn't have been demonstrate my methodology as good as I did because I had that advice. And then the other thing is that one did require a letter of recommendation from a professor, and I use my advisor. So I think it's really important that your advisor can speak to your research so it's getting reinforced not only by your application but by your letter of support.
Yeah, and on that note, like that is, I've gotten that comment on R&R, like actually giving raw text an example of coding in your process as a qualitative researcher. Yeah, that's like generally asked for more and more, I think.
And I've never actually done the diagrams. I was just like, oh, I'm just saying
didn't
this is
do
how
these.
I'm doing it, and then I was forced to think through it. So I think it made the application stronger, but it was also something I did, 2 days before the application was due.
Other questions, comments? So yeah, the Canadian job market is complicated, and getting a tenure track appointment is getting much more difficult, which is why we are coming together and providing these spaces for strengthening. You guys are at Penn. Imagine those who are not, but still is complicated. We are trying to